Hi, this is Frank Schaefer, and I want to thank you for sharing my YouTube videos and for watching them. And I would ask you, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. It helps what I'm doing and get the word out. Thank you. Hi, my name is Frank Schaefer. And let me put it this way. This atheist would like to talk about Jesus. Yes, I am an atheist. I come from an evangelical background. I fled that background and it's right-wing politics. But as the years have gone by, one thing that I have come to realize is a point made by perhaps the greatest writer on Roman history, with the exception of perhaps Mary Beard, Tom Holland, in his book Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World, a very important book that my wife Jeannie and I just finished listening to together and enjoyed very much. And now I'm rereading in book form. You see, we've just come through an election where Donald Trump was elected. One half of the country follows him. The other half of the country hates him. But there is a deeper division beneath this election than simply one of politics. And that's what I want to talk about. That's why this atheist wants to talk about Jesus. You see, basically, when you look at what happens to Christianity these days, there's a typical case that's just broken in Britain where Archbishop Justin Welby, the same archbishop that crowned King Charles recently, that you probably saw if you watched the coronation, as I did, he resigned after a lot of pressure was brought to bear because, like so many church leaders, he had been hiding a molestation case of a man who had molested over 100 children, in his case, boys. And Justin Welby had not followed this case up, but rather hidden the facts and moved it along in much the same way that so much of the Roman Catholic hierarchy has done with their child molesting. As Krista Brown points out in her book, Baptist Land, the heads of the Southern Baptist Church here in America did in not investigating the abuse of women by multiple pastors and simply moving them along. And of course, my friends on the left, my secular friends, kind of rub their hands at all these instances and say, you see, that's what Christianity is, the rape of little boys in churches by bishops and priests who won't do anything about it, even when they find out someone else has done it. You know, there's a problem with this, though. I don't want to overcomplicate matters, but the only standard by which this abuse is judged as wrong, the rape of children, is the Christian standard that was introduced by Jesus and put forward by the Apostle Paul. And the saying of Jesus that really started this idea out was, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And then the Apostle Paul, who said, in Jesus Christ, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, nor male nor female. The idea that the weak and the least of these, say a little boy being raped by a priest or a woman being hit up on by her pastor, boss, whatever, would in the end be those that the followers of Jesus would fight for and represent. You see, when Jesus put forward his revolutionary ideas, as Tom Holland puts out in his book, in the Roman Empire, it was in a context where no one would object to an older, powerful male raping a little boy or raping a maidservant girl. A 13-year-old working in a Roman senator's kitchen would expect to be violated nearly every day by someone in the compound with total impunity. When older men raped young boys or had sex with them, this was considered perfectly normal. The powerful taking their place, the idea of sympathy and justice and kindness and mercy and compassion for the least of these was simply unknown in the Roman Empire. in the same way that these concepts were unknown in Saudi Arabia, that traded in slaves until very recently, or when the Yazidis were enslaved, murdered, raped, and crucified by ISIS a few years ago in Iraq and bits of Kurdistan and Syria, in the same way that the abuse of the weak by the strong is the norm in world history. It is not the exception. The ideas of human rights we have derive directly from the teachings of Jesus. And when I say we, I mean the world that pontificates about human rights. When the United Nations, in its Declaration of Human Rights, made its claims about universal human rights, what it forgot to mention was that these are not universal ideas, that they came from a specific place, that this atheist who left my Christian faith, nevertheless, makes a point of saying, as Tom Holland does in Dominion, need to be recognized unless we are going to completely lose our way. What does this have to do with the recent election? Well, the left, or the secular left, or the secular humanist left, whatever you want to call it, the kind of people that have tenure in our big universities or who are on the editorial page of the New York Times, whatever, this secular establishment, this elite that the right criticizes and says looks down on them, etc., has had a penchant, not just recently, but actually as a group since the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, to pretend as if the ideas of the rights of man, sorry, that's how it was before people would say the rights of people or whomever, but the rights of man, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, somehow came out of thin air, that this had to do with secularism rejecting the brutality of Christianity. But the odd thing is, the only ethics that secular humanists, atheists, and others, such as myself, can draw on, or do draw on historically in order to make these points, are ethics that outside of the biblical tradition of the New Testament and the teachings of Jesus and the Apostle Paul, or the Old Testament and the teachings of the Jews in terms of the care even for slaves and the various rules they had about the treatments of strangers and so forth, are unknown in world history. These ideas of human rights don't exist outside of the context of Christian history, the Protestant Reformation, and so forth. Now, my friends on the left and myself would come back immediately and say, yes, 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 but what about Martin Luther's horrible anti-Semitism, him saying that Jews should be buried under the dirt and never heard from again, that played a part in the Holocaust and the rise of Nazi Germany. Quite so. But on the other hand, the resistance to anti-Semitism also has its roots within Christianity. The fact that it took thousands of years for slavery to be shown up as what it is, this inhuman, barbaric practice, had nothing to do with the Enlightenment or secularism as such. The very fact that the bishops of Rome, the popes, sometimes had slaves themselves, the very fact that Christians traded in slaves and the whole Southern Baptist denomination was created to defend slavery, nevertheless, has to be seen in the light of the fact that it was only 18th, 19th, and 20th century evangelicals who led the way against racism in the case of, say, Martin Luther King Jr., or before that, led the way against the legalization and the slave trade, without whom these changes would not have happened. So to pretend that those ethics, the followers of Jesus's ethics, were somehow backward, and that only those who deny the Bible, as I do, I don't believe Jesus raised from the dead, I don't believe in a virgin birth, I do not believe Jesus was the Son of God. But nevertheless, I understand that I am lucky to live in Western civilization. And I don't say that just as a white privileged man. I say that for anyone. Anyone who understands that world history cannot be understood outside of the context of the Christian ethic that was established by Jesus, fought for through every age of the church, however corrupt it was, over a long arc of history, that finally gave us the abolition of the slave trade, that finally gave us the rights of women As the author John Updike once mentioned in an article in the New Yorker, outside of the context of Western Christianity, the idea of feminism as a modern phenomena that we embrace as somehow a secular phenomena did not exist. That when you begin to toy with ideas such as that in Jesus Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile, male nor female, slave or free, or the idea that the least of these shall be first and the first shall be last, then all of a sudden you bring a new view to things such as the hubris of the male dominant tech bros beating their chests and going on shows like Joe Rogan, where all of a sudden manhood is seen very much in the Roman context as strength and domination of others rather than anything to do so weak, as Hitler would have put it, as the teachings of Jesus. Now, Hitler hated the Jews, and one of the reasons he hated them is he saw Judaism and Jews as the seedbed of this weak, vile faith called Christianity, in which ideas such as the last shall be first and the first shall be last came to fruition and produced a reformational Christianity that wound up with a new set of ethics that gradually, instead of all in step backs, took a step forward. So when you come up to Justin Welby having to resign as Archbishop of Canterbury, and people such as the, Christopher Hitchens, who was somebody I knew, by the way, before he died, the new atheist who wrote books about atheism, or Dawkins, someone like atheist Bill Maher likes to quote, or did at one point, or whoever, rub their hands and say, you see, another evidence of the weakness and the horror of Christianity and the evil and the sin and the manipulation and the backwardness of Christianity. What they don't add is, of course, the only standard on which Welby or some other person is judged is not the Roman standard of strength over weakness and the ability to rape your slave, but the Christian standard of the least shall be first and the first shall be last. And so how odd that Christianity's total triumph in the West is evident most in the atheism and the denial of Christianity and the idea that we should have freedom of conscience. That goes back to the 10th century, when it was Roman Catholic popes and bishops who began to see a difference between what they called the secular and the sacred. That concept doesn't even exist in Hinduism, which saw its nation as one Hindu nation, not as a religion, but as a way of life, nor, of course, in Islam even today. Whatever we talk about reconciliation with Islam and so forth, and the scholarship in Granada and Spain before Charles Martel chased the Muslims out of Europe, et cetera, nevertheless, these civilizations did not produce what we take for granted as a separation of church and state. That's our civilization. So I resent the fact that the secular and the left, if you like, and the liberals have venerated people like Alfred Kinsey, a serial rapist who did his sex research and began to publish it in 1947, masturbating children as young as 13 months old as an experiment, and having correspondence with other pedophiles. And we, on the left, and in the academic community, venerate people like Kinsey. Why? Because he broke taboos. Oh, great. Those were Christian taboos about chastity, marriage, love, fidelity. We cheer as heroes anybody who does. Read the New York Times. Every other op-ed in the New York Times is by someone who's discovered polyamory. Oh, it's a new thing. And of course, it's not new at all. It's just right out of ancient Rome. And shared wives and shared concubines and all the rest of it. There's nothing new about the modern trend on the liberal side of things towards these discoveries that take us beyond the constraints of Christianity. But then when it comes to Justin Welby, we take the constraints of Christianity and apply them to him and say, resign, because you have what? Sinned? No, we don't use that word. We just say we have someone here who has dominated weaker people. Where did that idea come from? The Roman Empire? The Syrian Empire, the Persian Empire? Not so much. It came from the people who challenged the absolute monarchs of Europe, beginning with the beginning of Christendom, a word that also has gone out of fashion. Where do I criticize Trump's MAGA Christians? In exactly the same way as I criticize the people on the left who love Alfred Kinsey, and think that Justin Welby somehow it's a triumph from their point of view that he defended a pedophile priest. Well, I criticize the MAGA Christians for the same reason. They claim to be Christians, and they tell us that they are somehow bringing us back to morality where we have departed morality, for instance, in having gay marriage or care and love for trans people. But the only standard on which they stand is also, like the left that won't acknowledge the teachings of Christ as formative to Western civilization, and the only reason we don't throw gay people off buildings to kill them the way Hezbollah does in Palestine when they had the authority to do so, or ISIS does, is because of a Christian standard which rebukes them as thoroughly as it rebukes Alfred Kinsey or Justin Welby, for that matter, on the other hand. One that says the last shall be first. And it is the least of these, it is the weak we should tend to. The whole fight in the history of Christendom, going back to the Roman Empire to our own times, has been between those Christians, such as too many popes, bishops, priests, and others, who have behaved like Roman landowners, raping, pillaging, killing, using their powers of position over others, and those Christians who at every point in Christian history drew from the teachings of Christ and took from them the idea that the last shall be first. Now, that idea applied, for instance, to our illegal immigrants today, who will be rounded up and put in concentration camps and then expelled, would not necessarily say we need an open border. In my personal humble opinion, as an observer of American politics, liberals have been very stupid in saying that somehow we should have an open border and ideas of internationalism and one world and one humanity, and that this applies to nation states. We still have nation states. We still have a right to an American passport that gives us privileges when we travel because we were born here. I was born in Switzerland. I can't be president of the United States. Sorry, folks. I never wanted to be, but I couldn't be because we have laws and we have a constitution, and that means that borders can't be open. But once someone is in our midst, as in the parable of the Good Samaritan, when only the Samaritan who was not the Jew and who was not the Christian, who was not, quote, one of us, he was an outsider taking care of someone who had been broken and hurt by the side of the road. That was the lesson of the gospel that Jesus was trying to teach. So as an atheist who wants to talk about Jesus, let me say this. I am glad I live in Western civilization. I am glad I am not a Palestinian being murdered and killed by Hamas. Yes, I said that, because they hide behind their own civilian population, and then the implacable, murderous Israeli military slaughters the Palestinian people. Two rights do not make a wrong, and two wrongs do not make a right. We have a quandary there. But for everyone that demonstrates and is on, quote, the side of Hamas, as it were, they have to remember that that strength over weakness, that hiding behind a civilian population, just as the settlers who were stealing land from the Palestinians on the West Bank, both live as if the teachings in the Old Testament about treating the stranger with dignity and the teachings in the New Testament about following a Lord that Christians claim is God's son means that you do not round people up and put them in concentration camps, and you do not bomb civilians, even if very wicked people are hiding behind them. You find other ways, difficult ways, just as it would be very difficult to figure out how to assimilate 10 to 20 million, quote, illegal aliens in our own country. But if MAGA actually was catering to the evangelicals who say they voted for Trump to bring us back to a moral Christian country, to quote people like Franklin Graham, the son of the Reverend Billy Graham, who I knew personally as a young person, and actually argued with about abortion rights, because at that time, back in the 1970s, I was an ardent pro-life advocate, another white man telling women what to do. Through my films that I made with my dad, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, that we also made with Dr. C. Everett Koop, who became Ronald Reagan's Surgeon General. And we argued that abortion was murder and that women must submit to men and do what we told them. But you see, The reason why abortion became legal in America is the same reason why we now have gay marriage, and that is that the stick of dynamite placed at the bottom of the edifice of our culture called Jesus blew up the idea that only the powerful should rule and that the male is the head of the home. Oh, I know the Apostle Paul said things like that, but he also said that in Christ there is neither male nor female. And then he got worried about what he had said, or someone else corrected the text in some of his other letters and said, yeah, but what I meant was submit to your husbands. And what I meant was, of course, we're all free in Christ, but slaves, you've got to still do work for your master, because, of course, he was also a creature of his time, a Pharisee, steeped in that tradition that had never blinked at slavery. But in the 19th century, in the 18th century, there came along some evangelicals and Christians who got very serious about the teachings of Jesus. And they said, whether the Apostle Paul said slavery was okay or not, we can't go that way. Why? And this is a new idea because we're following Jesus more closely than Paul did. And there came a generation of Christians in the United Kingdom, for instance, who have fought for the marriage rights of gay people within the Church of England on the basis that, following the teaching of Jesus, that the last shall be first and the first shall be last, and we uphold the weak. Well, who has been more weak and persecuted than the gay community in history, as the Black community has in America? The Christian witness always looks for the weakest and the saddest and the most oppressed among us to lift up. That is not a humanist idea coming from the French Revolution and that bloodbath that our secular liberal elite does not want to admit actually happened, in the same way they don't want to admit that Alfred Kinsey was a pedophile and a pervert and a liar who falsified his findings to try to make what he was doing okay. We've seen that before. But you see, when you get to Justin Welby having to resign under pressure because he covered up and aided and abetted the molestation of 100 young boys or more by this so-called pastor, you have exactly the same phenomenon. So when this atheist, Frank Schaeffer, wants to talk about Jesus Christ, what I want to mention is that one of the reasons MAGA is so divided from liberal America is both are denying Jesus. Both have said, somehow we can have Western civilization without the teaching of Christ. The tech bros' interest in eugenics, Neuralink, and all this other stuff, put 1 million people on Mars, build rockets even though they trash the environment. Power, money, Bitcoin, come on, let's go. Money, power, Wall Street. That's Roman. That's the spirit of raping your maid, your 13-year-old little girl serving at the table, and you push her into a corner and have your way with her because you're a powerful man. And that path leads to civilizational destruction. That path brings us all to become Iranians, raping little girls in prison cells because they won't wear head coverings. But so does the liberal path, because the liberal path doesn't want to admit that the inheritance of Christianity is unique. Isn't that Islamophobic? No, it isn't. Because when the Muslim is the least amongst us, we have to treat the Muslim as we would be treated. But what is anti-science and stupid is to always go to the next step and try to say that because we need to treat everyone in our midst as Christ would treat them, that somehow we have to rewrite science, as Alfred Kinsey tried to do. And fidelity is just a Christian construct. No, it's not. If you study, for instance, as we read in The Old Way by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, of what actual indigenous life was like in Africa and the Kalahari that had existed for 80,000 years, that she studied in the 1950s with her parents before any other contact with the outside world. They had a very secure idea about marriage. And it wasn't polygamous. It was something that, your Protestant evangelical conservative would recognize, heaven forfend, that there is such a thing as natural law. Doesn't that sound Catholic? Well, the Catholics were not all stupid, We live in a civilization in which our only hope of human rights rests in the teachings of Jesus. If you don't like that, too bad. That happens to be the truth. We live in a civilization that gives a place to science and fact. For instance, sorry, everybody, but gender is not assigned at birth. And then I quickly add that people who feel that they've been born in the wrong body have every right to be called by whatever pronoun they wish. And we have the duty as people who come from that Christian civilization called Christendom to herald them as the next frontier of human and civil rights and work with them. Science comes from that same point of view, that there is a reasonable God that created a universe that can be explored. It did not come from a secular beginning. Sure, Galileo was imprisoned by the papacy and the Inquisition for 11 years and spent the rest of his life under house arrest because the church was very stupid. But Galileo came out of that civilization nonetheless, and in the end, it corrected itself because history is long and the arc bends towards justice. My call on MAGA Trump voters is to remember what Jesus taught. And that includes ones who are not Christians or you're part of some militia group and carrying your AR-15. Do you really want to live in a world in which the least of these have no rights? And that might include you if you don't have a college education and the elites lord it over you and mock you. What is your right to be taken seriously and treated with kindness by the kinds of people that run the New York Times? That right is rooted back into your own civilization. It's called Christendom. And to the left, I would say the same thing. Stop pretending that your idea of human rights and dignity for gay people, for trans people, for women exists outside of this inheritance we have. Oh, you can be an atheist like me. I happen to be a very inconsistent atheist because I still pray. Still's the wrong word. I pray all the time. I want to thank somebody. I want to ask for blessing of my family and my friends and my country and my enemies. I don't believe, but I don't think belief is stupid. I think what is stupid is to pretend we are people other than we are. We are Western civilization. Deal with it. And in that civilization, with all its mighty sins, we are not defined by being brown or white or Jews or Christians or Muslims. We are defined by a common humanity that Martin Luther King Jr. stood for. And that's why identity politics has driven everybody crazy, because it is so counter to everything we should be. The point is not who's the oppressor and who was oppressed. We are all oppressors. I'm sorry. I lived in Africa for a year. Don't tell me that African countries and African tribes did not oppress each other. They are human, so of course they did. The question is there any light at the end of anybody's tunnel? Or are we all just going to be Romans oppressing anybody weaker than ourselves? The answer here is that we have to take serious our own civilization and we have to defend it. We are people of the West. And in the West, with all its failures, we have an idea of human rights. But that idea did not come from a vacuum. That idea was unknown until the teachings of Jesus Christ. I use that term out of respect for those who believe that Jesus was the Son of God. When we glory that Justin Welby had to resign and another horrible bishop and stupid priest was found out, let us remember the only reason we glory in that resignation is because all of us long for a higher standard. That higher standard was nailed to a cross by Romans who mocked weakness, very much like our tech bros mock weakness today. The choice is yours. Who do you want to follow? And who do you want to thank? My name is Frank Schaefer.